So the first system we're going to talk about is a fancy dragon variation. Here white goes for d4 because they need to open up their bishop, and now you achieve what you wanted to achieve. You trade your flank pawn for their central pawn. After that, black goes knight f6, attacking this pawn, white defends it, and here we go pawn to g6. Black wants to fianchetto their bishop because it is hard to develop it otherwise, and from g7 this bishop is going to exert this long-term pressure against white's knight, the other knight, and maybe the queen side overall. So that's the dragon variation. It is named after the Draco constellation, because black used to have this pawn on c5, and overall this somewhat resembles the constellation. Anyway, white usually goes for bishop e3, black puts their bishop to g7, and after that both sides develop their pieces. Generally in the dragon, as well as overall across Sicilian, the most dangerous setup by white is to castle queenside, and they do this by playing f3, which defends the pawn as well as it guards the square so that black can't jump there with either a bishop or knight. So black develops, white goes queen d2, getting ready to castle, then both sides castle, and we reach the point with this very interesting middle game position. White often also plays bishop c4 to put the bishop to an active diagonal. Let's say black develops and white reaches this queenside castling. Now, with opposite side castlings, we expect both sides to attack each other viciously. White is going to play h4, h5, in order to trade and to open up the rook and the h-file. White also typically goes bishop h6 to trade the main defender of the black king, and since this plan is so simple for white, it is considered quite dangerous for black to go into the main line of the dragon variation, although of course black has their counterplay, and if you know what you're doing, it's going to be a very sharp, dynamic, and complicated battle. I think it is best described by the famous song It's My Line, and if the following describes you well, then the dragon variation may be just for you. This ain't opening for the broken-hearted, no silent lines for faith departed, and I ain't gonna be just a pawn in the crowd, you're gonna hear they scream when I play it all out. To those who are not that reckless, there is a good alternative called the accelerated dragon. In this case, black goes knight to c6 first, and after white plays d4 and trades in the center, black still fianchettos their kingside bishop with the same purpose of putting pressure to the white's center and queenside. White goes knight c3, bishop g7. In this case, we're actually hitting this knight on d4 and white needs to defend it. Then you play knight f6, so pretty much the same moves as in the dragon variation, but there is one subtle difference. Your pawn is still on d7, not on d6, and it's gonna be important, because if white tries to follow the same plan and just play pawn f3, and they play queen to d2, trying to kind of push the same plan with the long side castling, it actually fails. Because thanks to your pawn being still on d7, you can strike in the center with the move pawn to d5. And you don't have to waste a tempo by playing d6 first and then d5 in two moves. You can strike right away with the move pawn d5, and white's position kind of crumbles. They can't really get what they wanted. Now you start putting pressure here in the middle. If they trade, your knight from d5 is also exerts strong pressure. Also, this opens up your bishop, and overall, as you can see, it just doesn't look that good for white. Now your queen is also active. Now you put pressure all around, and like in these lines, black already has a good position. Your bishop is super active. That's exactly what we want from all the dragon variations. You can bring the other bishop to f5, and white is already somewhat in trouble. It's actually a very good system for club level players, and it's one of the best ways for black to play the Sicilian. There is really no downsides, besides the fact that you probably have to pay something to Sicilian Mafia for the right to use it. Coming up next is the bishop c4, known as the I don't know how to play variation. White just plays as if you played pawn to e5 instead of the Sicilian. But bishop c4 is an uncalled here, pros literally never played, although on the level below 1500 you're gonna face it frequently. They can play bishop c4 right away, or they may first play knight f3 and then bishop c4, which doesn't really change anything. Now, against bishop c4, you can play pawn e6, which really blocks this diagonal, making it completely useless. Moreover, you threaten to go d5, something is wrong with my arrows, pawn d5 yourself, winning a tempo in order to attack that bishop. And after e6, let's say they play knight f3, you can really go hard on this bishop. You can also play a6, which is a standard Sicilian defense moves, getting ready to play b5, and sometimes your opponents are even gonna lose this bishop, because in this variation, you just win it. Even if your opponent prevents this by going pawn a4, you can still play knight f6, attacking this pawn, and on the next move, regardless of what your opponent plays, even if they push forward, in all the cases you play pawn d5, striking this bishop. And you achieve what you wanted to achieve. You actually gain a tempo, so white now has to trade. Now you grab the center, you force them to lose time to retreat with the bishop. Also, you took away the square b5, so they can't even go forward, they have to go back. And after that, you can either just develop casually, and you've got a great position, or if you want to be really tough, you can also play queen e7 check to the king, because there is no convenient way for white to cover it. They have to play a king move and lose the right castle, which is inconvenient, because if they try to cover, then you just play d4 and you win a piece thanks to this piece. Alright, the next one is the najdorf variation, the favorite variation of pros. If there are two top-level grandmasters who are playing a game of chess, it's quite likely that it will come to this position, the starting position of the najdorf variation. It was first popularized by Bobby Fischer, who used to play it throughout his basically entire chess career. Later on, Garry Kasparov picked it up and also played it extensively in his career, and right now, like again, all the top players basically play it. Now, the beauty of the najdorf variation is that it is really flexible. Black hasn't committed yet to any particular setup. They only played knight f6, which is a must move for them, but the rest remains to be completely flexible. For example, you can always play b5 if necessary. If, let's say, at some point white develops the bishop right there, you're always ready to strike it with b5, and then your pawn can go forward and kick off this knight from c3. Also, if white plays passively, let's say, something like bishop e2, then you can be more ambitious, and instead of playing pawn to e6, you can play pawn e5, grab space in the center, and chase away this knight. Also, notice that our pawn from a6 controls this square, so white can't go forward, they'll have to go back. So e5 is an option. Although, if, let's say, white chooses to play bishop g5, putting pressure down here, then you may say, okay, e5 might be not as good, because in this case, like, down the road, after this knight retreats, this square on d5 may be vulnerable. And then you say, okay, you know what, I'm gonna play pawn e6, and then I, defend my knight, but also I cover this square. So you see, it's really, really flexible. After all, you can even switch back to the dragon variation if you want to on the next turn. So because it's so flexible, you can always choose the best setup depending on what your opponent plays. But with that being said, although it's objectively a really good variation to play, and again, there is a reason why all the top players played, but it's also very complex, and frankly, I would not recommend that you play it unless you are rated 2000 or above. That said, I don't want to discourage you. I understand that it might seem like 2000 rating is something very difficult to achieve. In fact, it is not true, and recently I recorded a video with 2 main rules that you need to know in order to reach that rating level, and I'll drop a link below in the description so you can check it out later, and hopefully you will get to this level much faster. The next setup is the classical variation of the Sicilian defense. It is called that way because you do play the most classical moves indeed. You develop your minor pieces as, common chess wisdom suggests you to do. Then you play knight f6, hitting this pawn, and after white defends it with their knight, you then play pawn to d6 to open a diagonal for this bishop. So this is the classical system, one of the good ways to play the Sicilian defense. However, after white goes bishop g5, white has a somewhat greater initiative, and that's the reason why this is still not the most popular setup for black. And it's still playable because on amateur level, most players play bishop e3, kind of trying to push the same plan, that we discussed earlier against the dragon variation with the queenside castling. But in this case, you have a very interesting opportunity to counter that. You can go knight g4, attacking this bishop and threatening to ruin their pawn structure. And after the bishop runs away somewhere, you then all of a sudden play queen b6, which hits this pawn on b2, as well as this knight on d4. And there were thousands and thousands of games where white decided to move this knight somewhere, either to retreat to b3 or to trade on c6. But then instead of recapturing, you just play queen f2, boom, checkmate. The next one is a so-called French variation of the Sicilian defense. And quite similar to the French defense, this is a more positional setup, and it's actually a very good entry point for you to start playing the Sicilian defense without the necessity to learn a whole lot of variations or being willing to counter those crazy lines with mutual attacks and sacrifices. Again, one of the good ways for you to start playing the Sicilian defense. In fact, this has been one of my main opening weapons that I've been playing throughout the years, both on intermediates and all the way up to GM level, and has been serving me really well. On the next move, you also play an interesting move, queen c7. And although at first it looks a little bit strange, you kind of violate the opening rules and you don't develop your minor pieces, but somehow it works pretty well for black. Also, this setup is very flexible. You're still having the flexibility of how to develop your pieces. And another big advantage of this setup is that the most dangerous plan with the queenside castling here does not work against it. So if your opponent tries to play this, you then play knight f6, and after queen d2 you play bishop b4. Something that you rarely have an opportunity to do in the Sicilian, but here it's kind of annoying. And you actually threaten knight takes c4 because of this pin. They need to defend this pawn, so they go pawn f3, now you strike in the center with pawn d5. If they trade it, good for you, you recapture with a knight, still reinforcing all your threats, and your position is great. If they try to maintain their position, then it loses to another sudden move, pawn e5, attacking this knight, and after it goes, you push forward with d4 and you win a minor piece thanks to this double attack. You can't imagine how many blitz games I won following this exact move order. The next setup is a so-called Pelican or Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian defense. Initially you develop both your knights, but then you play a more ambitious move, pawn to e5. This is a more aggressive way for black to play the Sicilian, and now you want to gain some space in the middle of the board as well as to hit this knight on d4. Now, the knight should go, and of course, white does not want to just passively retreat back. The best thing for white to do is to go forward with knight to b5. However, on amateur level, quite often they'll just trade on c6, which is nice for you, because now you reinforce your center. Your flank pawn moves closer to the center. Now it controls this square. In the future, you can even play d5 and grab the center completely, and that's great for black. So instead, the right way for white is to jump with their knight to b5. And here white tries to capitalize on the weakness of your position, which is this hole on d6 and maybe this square d5. In order to cover that weakness, black goes pawn to d6, and after that white continues with bishop g5. They want to pin this knight so that their other knight is ready to go on d5 and to occupy another weakness of black's position. However, black has their pros as well. This knight on b5 is currently doing nothing. Black can kick it off, and after knight a3 they can play b5, taking away the last square where this knight could possibly go to, and now this knight on a3 is completely out of the game. In fact, the only square where it could go to would be b1, which would be quite funny because white spent a whole lot of time to reposition the knight from one starting square to the other one, so that would be quite an epic failure. All in all, it's a very interesting and imbalanced position with mutual chances, and although GMs love playing this, honestly, again, I would not recommend that you play it unless you're rated 2000 and above, just because, it's quite a complicated position, you have to know a lot of stuff here. There is another popular system that white can initiate. It is the Smith-Morra gambit, where white gambits a pawn seeking quick development and hoping to develop a crushing attack. After that, both sides develop their pieces, and there is a very common trap here in this line. If black feels uncomfortable developing their knight because it can be attacked, they may play d6 first, but after bishop c4, black feels that it's now safe to bring the knight out to f6. However, it's not the case because white can strike in the center with a pawn to e5. And all of a sudden, it turns out that white has a really strong attack. For example, if black trades on e5 and accepts the gambit pawn, then bishop takes f7 just wins the game. It distracts the king from the defense of the queen, and after that, the queen is lost and white wins the game. Of course, black could have and should have played better, but anyway, it illustrates what white is hoping for in the Smith-Morra gambit. They're hoping for quick and natural development, and after that, rushing to their attack. Overall, it's a very good system for white to play. I've got a dedicated video about it, so if you're curious, I'll link it below in the description. The next setup works really well on amateur level. It is a so-called Lowenthal variation of the Sicilian defense, where you strike early with the move pawn to e5, attacking this knight. Now, here's the beauty. On amateur level, most of your opponents are going to trade on c6, which is wrong, and it provides you with a good position. As we already know from one of the previous lines, it is actually better for white to try to capitalize on these weaknesses and go with their knight forward to b5, trying to go there inside, and that leads to a complicated game. However, most of your amateur opponents will just trade on c6, making your position better, because now you're able to use your flank pawn and move it closer towards the center of the board. Moreover, in the long run, maybe you can even play d5 and occupy the center completely. But right now, you just have this very natural development. You can bring the bishop there to c5 or maybe to b4 and to pin this knight. You've got this semi-open juicy file for your rook, and overall life's great. So that's one of the ways that you can really play the Sicilian defense easily and successfully. It's also worth mentioning the Alapin variation of the Sicilian defense, pawn to c3, the system that can be initiated by white. Here white says, I know, you want to trade off my central pawn for your flank pawn, and I'm not going to give it to you. I'm going to play pawn to c3, and if you play any irrelevant move, for example knight c6, which is the most played move on amateur level, and it is wrong because it doesn't do anything against your opponent's plan, white is capable of playing pawn d4, and now that's exactly what they want. They build their strong center, and if you trade, they don't lose their central pawn because they replace it with the other one, and they achieve this perfect setup. For that reason, it's actually quite a good opening for white to play the Alapin variation. Now, what's the correct way for black to counter the Alapin? Well, the correct way is to use the downside of this move pawn to c3. It obstructs development of the knight. White's knight cannot go to c3, and if white had this knight on c3, it would control these two important central squares. However, in the Alapin variation, that's not the case. So these squares are not controlled by white, meaning that you can strike there either by playing d5 right away or by going knight f6 and hitting this pawn on e4. So both these options, knight f6 and d5, are good options to counter the Alapin and to reach a good position. Anyway, the position remains to be interesting. For example, in one of the main lines of the Alapin, it could be that we will reach the point with the isolated pawn in the center of the board, which is a weakness, but on the other hand, white has easy development, and sometimes if black doesn't know what they're doing, they can easily get in trouble. For example, if black tries to kind of be active, but then they encounter this counterplay from white, and if black doesn't know what they're doing, again d5, and black is already in trouble. Now this knight has to go back. If they try to go forward, trying to